G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with part 19 of my partial book reading series, One Crowded Hour, Tim Bowden's biography of Neil Davis, combat cameraman. We now look at the first part of chapter 17, With the Viet Cong, which is a level of coverage of Vietnam combat that not many Australian correspondents or American correspondents ever actually achieved. This is a 1970 photograph from Cambodia, and as you can see, Davis is steadying himself on the corpse of a Khmer soldier, so he can be in front of an advancing Khmer soldier. So he's actually between the two fighting forces there. He was a gung-ho fella indeed. Hawkeye. First beer of the day. Chapter 17, With the Viet Cong. Letter to Aunt Lillian, 1 March 1973. Goodwood Park Hotel, Singapore. I wasn't able to tell you by letter from Saigon that I spent some time in South Vietnam with the Viet Cong, and that was really strange, especially when a South Vietnamese helicopter sighted us and attacked. So I was in the very peculiar position of crouching in a bunker with 5 VC soldiers, whilst my friends above did their darndest to wipe us out. However, it was intensely interesting, to say the least. Filming the Viet Cong had been a long-term goal, but it was not practical in the early years of the war. But following the Paris peace talks and the involvement of the International Control Commission, it was politically desirable for the Viet Cong to show the world that they had areas of South Vietnam under their flag and control. Fighting was still going on, of course, and Davis knew that the South Vietnamese government would do all they could to stop foreign correspondents giving a propaganda advantage to the enemy. I wanted to film the other side in action, to hear what they had to say, to see how they lived, and to see the response they got from the people they were living with and fighting for. I did the same thing continually with the South Vietnamese, and I had sympathy with both groups. Each was fighting for their people, yet were ideologically diametrically opposed. That is the sad thing about any civil war. To make contact with the Viet Cong, Davis had to find a reliable double agent. He knew that the communists had such agents all through the South Vietnamese army and civil bureaucracy, and the Viet Cong later admitted that their districts and institutions were well penetrated by government agents. I finally made contact with a double agent who happened to be a sergeant interpreter for an American major in the Mekong Delta. Paradoxically, he was a trustworthy double agent. To complete this Alice through the looking glass world of spy and counter-spy, the American major was well aware that his sergeant was a double agent. A fact Davis discovered after some delicate verbal fencing with the major over his wish to film with the Viet Cong. Finally, the major said, "Perhaps you should talk to my sergeant." I admitted I already had, and the American said, "Okay, stick with him. He'll get you there." I said, "Don't you worry about this?" "Oh, no," said the major. "He's a complete double agent, and he's useful to both of us." I found out that the sergeant knew the major was aware of his role, but they never mentioned it. The major wasn't afraid for his life because he saw that the link was necessary. The sergeant respected the American as a good man and used his influence with the VC to stop him being killed. Of course, the Viet Cong didn't really want him there, but they didn't kill him either. And to think that there are some people who still believe that Mad Comics' black spy versus white spy routine is unrealistic. Whereas it's actually a perfectly literal portrayal of the world the way it works. The sergeant told Davis to drive his jeep along a certain stretch of Highway 4 and look out for an old man who would hail him for a lift. I had to meet him at 11 a.m. near a bridge. He was a nice old man of about 70 who looked a bit like Ho Chi Minh, with a little wispy beard. We drove up and down the road for about half an hour discussing the situation and my credentials. They knew who I was, and he said they had checked me out. I said, "How could you check me out?" The old man said, "Through the Ministry of Information in Saigon. We have our people working there too. And of course they did. Davis met the old man on 3 occasions and was asked all kinds of leading questions. One was, what would you do if you were bombed? It was a pertinent question. The Americans were using massive pattern bombing by B-52 aircraft, which flew from Guam. The Vietnamese called the giant bombers the Whispering Death because they were so high they could not even be seen from the ground. Each B-52 carried 30 tons of bombs, and they flew in an arrow formation. 30 or 40 aircraft could drop their loads simultaneously. I would have been, 11 or 12 at that kind of stage of things. The Americans were on the point of using nuclear weapons on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, perhaps Haiphong Harbour as well, but definitely they were planning or thinking about nuking the Ho Chi Minh Trail to try and cut off supplies. I remember the newspaper headlines, Nixon ready to use N-bombs in Nam on a Sunday morning as I was bringing the newspaper back home from the corner shop. The first thing the Viet Cong would know was that they were being obliterated. The carpet bombing was incredibly accurate and a mixture of bombs were dropped. High explosive bombs were meant to shatter deep bunkers as shock waves surged through the ground. Cluster bombs were detonated at treetop level, spewing out tens of thousands of tiny needle-sharp fragments of shrapnel that could riddle your body and tear you to pieces. Also included in the mix were phosphorus bombs, which not only set fire to everything on top of the ground, but burned up all the oxygen in the air. People on ground or below the ground who might have survived the high explosive and cluster bombs were suffocated. But the blast killed most people. It ruptured everything inside, and blood poured from every orifice. You can imagine the tremendous blast created by 50 to 100 bombs dropping within the space of a few seconds over a limited area. It was just devastating and sounded like rolling thunder from a distance. The Americans called it arc lighting. We'll arc light them, they would say. Afterwards, the ground was intersected by overlapping craters 2 metres deep and 5 metres across, and it was like walking over a giant pockmarked face. It is very difficult to imagine that anyone lived after being pounded by the B-52s, but in fact they did. The Viet Cong told me that they would come up out of their bunkers and lie on top of the ground because the shock waves would kill them inside. On top, it flowed over them like the sea, and it was possible to survive. Davis was more apprehensive about the B-52 strikes than about his reception by the Viet Cong. He discussed this with the American major, who said he could guarantee to hold off the B-52s for 3 days because he was the senior advisor in that area of the Mekong, and the raids were mounted on his advice. However, there was also the possibility of being attacked by South Vietnamese helicopter gunships. That could not be ruled out, but Davis decided to take the risk. From an arranged entry point on Highway 4, about 80 kilometres southwest of Saigon, Davis began the walk that would briefly convert enemy to ally. Practicing the Vietnamese phrase for liberated area, he crossed the paddy fields and entered the light jungle. I field tested this phrase on the first Vietnamese farmer I saw, and he pointed to a line of trees. I walked straight in and came to a crossroads on the jungle path. A young man there just nodded in the direction I had to go. The rendezvous was in a small jungle clearing over which flew a Viet Cong flag and where several serious young soldiers were waiting. It was a tense moment, not helped when some small boys raced up to me and pointed dramatically at the soldiers, shouting, "VC! VC!" I was stunned. VC is a derogatory expression coined by the Americans, meaning roughly Vietnamese commie. The soldiers' reaction was to laugh delightedly. It broke the tension, and they embraced me in welcome. An old man came forward with an outstretched hand and said, "Welcome to the liberated area." The old man led me to a rickety sampan, and a boy took the paddle to pull us further into the liberated area. All along the riverbank, the Viet Cong flag, a yellow star on a blue and red background, fluttered from the houses and huts. "Nothing to liberate here," the old man said, and smiled. We were still only a few kilometres from the busy highway running to Saigon. Stepping from the sampan, Davis was met by an older French-speaking Vietnamese, who was the leader of the village and assigned to stay with him the whole time as he was with the Viet Cong. or National Liberation Front, as they called themselves. None of the soldiers I saw wore the legendary black pyjamas. Most wore tattered black trousers and blue shirts and looked like the hard-working sons of farmers. Some had captured M16 rifles, but most carried Russian or Chinese-made AK-47 rifles, which stood up better in the rough conditions of guerrilla warfare. The soldiers crowded round Davis with all kinds of questions. Why was he not married if he was over 30? Many of the Liberation Front soldiers were much younger than Neil, and they boasted families of 7 or 8 children. But some of these were the adopted children of captured or killed comrades. The soldiers posed with fierce expressions as I shot film, but invariably broke into laughter as the children shouted at them. Right, that's the first half of the chapter. I shall return with episode 20 of One Crowded Hour, Jim Bowden's biography of Neil Davis, combat cameraman.